and I'm a sourdough expert only because I've done it. Like I didn't do any fancy training. I learned on Instagram. So I started a sourdough before it was cool because I started it in March 1st. I looked back at my pictures, March 1st of 2020, so way before the pandemic, okay? 2 weeks before. So, anyways, my sourdough that I have, this little gal right here is going to be 3 years old in March, so I'm really excited.
So I feel like we should clap for that.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a kind of like a sourdough, I don't know, tradition or whatever, if you will, to name your sourdough. And there's a lot of really punny sourdough names out there. If you Google like sourdough puns, there's a lot of hilarious ones. I went with sentimental. I named her Betty after my grandma because she like loved me. Like that's where I feel like I cook like a grandma. So I named her Betty. So no fun sourdough puns. But does anybody know like, I guess what sourdough even is? Like, or is it just like something we just know as yummy bread? Yummy bread, got it. Okay, so sourdough is like the ancient form of yeast. So like previous to 100 years ago, this is like the only way you could make bread because there was no such thing as like yeast like we know, you know. So, and I think like they've even found like sourdough starters like this, like dried up in like ancient places, you know, like thousands of years old. Wow. So it's, you know, like when you're watching shows that are taking place like centuries ago, they were eating sourdough bread. So that's kind of fun. So today I'm going to talk about like a couple different ways to do sourdough. There is like the more precise scientific way, which I know Kate will do because I know how Kate does recipes. You know, the follow the thing to the T. And then there's like the grandma style of sourdough, which is like, you know, this looks good. The grandma style still works, but I'll kind of, you know, tell you a couple times when scientific is, the more precise way is probably better, like when you're making more of like an artisan loaf of bread or whatever. So, the reason why I even started to do sourdough is because I had a really picky toddler that didn't want to eat anything but bread, and that's very humbling. I was like, oh, he's gonna eat bread, we might as well like try to get some nutrients in there. And that's what even started me on sourdough. Because like she said, sourdough is fermented. So this is basically fermented flour that's kind of built up its own microbiome. So there's bacteria in here. That's what makes these bubbles. That's what makes it happy. And this bacteria in here digests the gluten. So when you're making a recipe, it's digesting that gluten, which essentially makes it easier to digest for us because this has already done some work for us. So the longer you ferment a recipe, so if you make a loaf of bread or you make some pancakes, the longer you let that sit before you bake it, the more of the gluten's digested. So one of the bloggers I shared, Farmhouse on Boone, she talks a lot about this in her stuff, but because she has a lot of people that come to her recipes with stomach sensitivities, and so they have noted the longer they ferment. So like some people, if they're gonna make pancakes, will let it ferment for almost 24 hours or sometimes up to 3 days in the fridge, a recipe before they bake it, and their family has no issues when they were previously sensitive to gluten. This is not allergy, you know, like an allergy is an allergy, but sensitivity, some people find relief in the
like the low FODMAP is sourdough is good.
Right, because of that, and that's why it gets on that list, is because this little baby does some work for you, so your stomach doesn't have to. And then also gives your stomach back good bacteria that helps with other things. The other reason why I love sourdough is because it's fewer recipes. It's insane. Every time I find a new recipe, I almost like laugh because every recipe is a different combination of flour, water, starter, and salt. And then maybe some honey. And then maybe a couple eggs. Like, it's insane. And then some, you know, sugar. But like, it's like literally 5 ingredients that they just like, here's a different, like, it's kind of crazy. They all come down to the same list of ingredients. There's no crazy, funky things. So it's kind of fun. The other thing I love sourdough is the sustainability. You're making it yourself. You know, all the reasons that this group was kind of formed, you know. And then I also like have a goal of being like a grandma. Like I just want to be looked at as like a grandma-ly figure. So that's the other reason I love sourdough, because it feels very grandma-ish. So this is the starter. Now, this is kind of how you create the recipe. So this is what you use as yeast. So if you're making a recipe, you would use this instead of yeast. And like, depending on how much, depends on the recipe, and we're gonna kind of get into some of that. But this is what all recipes will call, usually they call them a starter, a sourdough starter. Sometimes some recipes will use like natural yeast, or I don't know if you come up, I mean, but most of them now just call it a starter, use sourdough starter. Now, this thing must be fed to be kept, to keep this microbiome happy and alive. And yeah, we'll go into that now. I was trying to just like see where we wanted to go with this. And please, like if you guys have questions as I'm going, just ask them, because I don't want to just stand here and talk all day. But I will, because I like talking. I'm just going to dive right in how to maintain the starter, and then we'll kind of go into how to use it in the recipes. So you can store your starter in the fridge or on the counter. A starter likes to be warm when it's active. So in order to like get the bacteria happy, it needs to be in a warmer place. So when you put it in the fridge, the growth slows down. It doesn't kill it, but it slows down. So I keep it in the fridge if I'm not gonna bake for a while, or if I'm not gonna use it. But if you're gonna use it, you're gonna want it on the counter to be happy and active.
How long can you put it in the fridge? Like what if you go on vacation or something?
It is really hard to actually kill a starter. Some people are like, oh, I killed it.
I killed one.
You probably didn't actually kill it, you just thought you did. I mean, it can have like a big old black juice on top of it, and it's still, it's fine. That just means it's hungry. That's called hooch. This is a fun name.
I usually try to feed mine at least once a week.
Yeah, so once a week is standard in the fridge. 2 weeks, probably still okay. If you go past, you can still revive it. It'll just take longer, and you'll probably have to dump some ugly black liquid off the top. But maintenance, weekly in the fridge, you would feed it daily if it's on your counter. So that's why if you're not going to be using it, you would keep it in the fridge to kind of, you know, you're not wasting the thing. Because that's the thing, that when you have it on the counter, you have to feed it daily. So if you're not using it, you're either building up a lot of starter, or you have to discard some. And if you're not baking with it, then you just throw it away, which I've done a lot, but it's okay.
What were their names?
Rest in peace.
Yeah. Sorry. When you feed your starter, you need to use unbleached flour. There's a lot of different types of flour out there. I just use right now King Arthur unbleached, unbromated flour. I get it at Costco. I think you use a special one from somewhere. Where was it?
I use Sunrise Flour Mill from Minnesota, and so it's a heritage wheat. So that can also make a difference if you have like gluten sensitivities and stuff like that. Like the heritage wheat, it's non-GMO, it's not processed, anything like that. So like my white flour is, it's white because of the wheat berry that they use and stuff. They don't bleach it or do anything else to it. So I really like their stuff.
When I started diving into sourdough, I learned a lot about flours. So the different types of flour have different protein content. And so all-purpose generally has, I think, around 10 or 11% protein. And then as you know, like a bread flour has a higher content. What that means is just how the gluten's going to act in the dough. So you want a stronger flour when you're making bread. That's why bread flour has a higher protein content. Whereas when you're doing those baked goods like cakes and stuff, like cake flour has less protein content because they want it to fluffy and be moist. So you can kind of think about that. Most recipes can almost always be made with all-purpose, but then it's, as you add different flours, you can kind of like adjust the firmness, the flavor, the texture, all of that. if you want to get fancy with it. If you want to kick it, chill, all-purpose works for almost all recipes. So there's like the easy way or the fun, spice it up way. The other thing is you need to use filtered water. Not fancy, just cannot have chlorine in it. So a lot of tap water in urban areas has chlorine in the water. If you're in Omaha and you fill your bathtub up, it kind of can smell bleachy, at least in our house. So,
Is reverse osmosis filtered?
It's yes, as long as it has a remineralizer. So if your RO unit doesn't have a remineralizer, then you're probably just gonna want to get like spring water from the store.
And if you just get like a $1 jug at Hy-Vee that just says filtered water or spring water,
yeah,
Okay.
it's fine.
I'll just do that.
Yeah, it's not expensive, but I use a Berkey water filter and it's great. So yeah. And before I had my Berkey, I would literally just walk over to my friend's house and fill a gallon jug with her Berkey water and bring it to my house and use it over there. So you can do that too.
And if you do only have, like, if you're in a pinch, you just need to use tap water. If you fill up your tap water and let it sit out for like 24 hours, I think that gets a lot of that chlorine out of it, but not ideal. Like, I would only do that in like.
And the reason that affects it is because what does chlorine do? Chlorine is in our water to kill bacteria, and we're trying to make bacteria happy. So that's the reason. It's not going to, like, if you do it in a pinch, it won't like kill your starter forever. It just might not be active. It might not be as happy for a while, and you might have to give it some love for a couple days. So the question I get probably astronomically the most is how much to feed my starter. It's like everybody's question. Now, this is a very hard question to answer, especially for people who like precision. But I kind of relate it to, like, this is going to be an extension of your family. This is going to be your other kid, your other pet. Like, this is it. And everybody that either has a pet or a child knows, like, you kind of just know things for no reason. You know when your dog has to go to the bathroom and no one else will understand how you knew that. Like, oh, she's got to go poop. How did you know that? She was just walking. Or your kid, like, you know that they're hungry. So you kind of start to get a vibe with your sourdough. You'll get to know him or her. How would they identify? But you'll get to know them for, like, as you kind of flow. So don't stress. There's two factors that I kind of play into the equation. The first is, what are you going to use it for? And how much are you going to need for that recipe? So if you're baking a loaf and you're going to need, 50 grams, you want to make sure you have at least 50 grams of starter and a little extra to feed again. So that's a little bit of a guide as how much you're going to use of it. And then the other thing would be how much starter is already in there. So this is considered kind of a lot of starter. I fed it so I could share it today, so I fed it a lot. This would need to be fed a lot of starter because there's a lot of volume already in here. If you have just a tiny bit of starter, you can feed it a smaller amount because there's not as much. So a little can be fed a little and can be fed a lot if you need to get more. A lot can only be fed a lot because it's going to be hungry. If I only fed it a little, it's not going to grow and become active because it's still hungry. It's not happy. It's like a baby that only got half a bottle. It's still hungry. So, and what I say by active, so right now this is active. You see all these bubbles. Okay. She's going to show you. You have a lot of this here.
I know, I need to bake. So here's not active.
So this is not active. So it's really dense, and you can even see it's like pretty thick.
But it's still okay.
It's still okay. It's just not active and happy.
So to get it active, you just set it out.
Set it out and then feed it.
So for this though, this is my discard. So you can see I've like been adding to it like periodically. I just keep this in the fridge, and when I need to discard, which she'll talk about, I just add it into this jar. And then if I ever want to bake or something and I need a recipe for discard, I just pull this out, let it warm up a little bit, and dump some out. And that's
So something will say discard.
Yes.
some recipes differentiate between active and discard. You can always use active, but you can't always use discard.
Right. So an active means it's bubbly and happy. Recipes will call for active when some sort of rising needs to happen. So all bread recipes will need active starter. Sometimes like muffins or something where there's like some rising happening. Discard recipes are often used in cookies, pancakes, some pizza dough, stuff where like think flat, you don't want it to rise, but you want that flavor. You still want it to like you eat, digest those grains for you, but it doesn't necessarily need to rise. Then you can use your discard. So that's kind of the vibe there. And I will say, I created like a little sourdough resource guide. I didn't type this all out. I just linked a bunch of really awesome resources that are out there. There's and all of them are free. There's one ebook and then a bunch of blogs that literally walk through everything I'm talking about. So when you go back, it'll make sense or you can see it, so don't feel like you have to memorize this all today, but.
And I was like, I should have brought my pen and paper.
I know, but, and a couple of the blogs are nice because she broke it down to like, it talks about discard or it talks about troubleshooting problems or it talks about, whatever. So don't be stressed there. Then let's see. Do we want to have, we can do that. So the next thing about sourdough is timing. That's the other biggest hurdle. Sourdough isn't difficult, it's just different and you have to get used to the timing. If you're gonna bake a loaf of bread, you need to start thinking about this 24 hours before that. You start by feeding the sourdough, making it active. Then which sometimes can take 8 to 10 hours. If your house is really warm, it can take 4 to 5. And you'll get used to that. So you'll know your starter, you know how long it takes. That's part of that intuition thing you'll learn. So then at night, you'll prep the loaf, then it ferments overnight or however long you want to, and then you bake it in the morning. Or the next day. So we've, 24 hours. Now it's not hard. There's not a lot of intensive steps. It's just getting used to the pattern of baking. It's getting used to that time schedule. That's kind of the hard part.
Having to prepare ahead of time.
Yes. So like if you want to make a loaf of bread, you're not going to be doing it the traditional sourdough way if you're going to make, unless you plan for the next day. Things like bagels, breads, pancakes, anything that, and if you want a longer ferment, especially, you will need to plan ahead. But there are some recipes like the muffins I made today. A lot of cookies can be made same day, but they're not gonna have done their full digestive job. They're just gonna kind of have flavor and be a little bit of a rising agent for you.
Especially if you're concerned about the gluten, you definitely want to have that. If you're not concerned about that, like I've got a cottage loaf recipe there. That's same day, so you could start that in the morning and have it for dinner. And then I've done a quick bread type thing. Like the other night I was like, I decided the lesson, I was like, I really want some bread. And so I combined like a quick loaf recipe that I had, and then I put some sourdough starter in there and some honey and let it sit for like a quick ferment basically. So it had like baking powder and stuff to get the rise, but then I had the sourdough in there for just a little bit of like the flavor and stuff. So you can play with it, but for the full effects and things, like Jess was saying, like you do have to allow time.
And sometimes they'll have you, and like depending on different recipes, that's the thing. A lot of recipes have done the hard work for you, so then they'll be like, just ferment this in the fridge for 24 or 48 hours or things like that. So that's kind of nice. I know those blogs are really long, but a lot of the sourdough blogs are really nice because they're not talking about their life story. They're more breaking down the parts of the recipe for you. So that's kind of nice. So like, yeah,
helpful.
Exactly. So they'll walk through a lot of those questions, or even in the comments too, there's a lot of stuff that people, another thing that matters is, even whether you're fermenting or you're getting your starter to active, is the temperature. So if your home is in like the 65 to 68 degree range, it's going to take longer for your starter to get happy. If in the summer, you'll notice a difference between seasons. Our house, the back of our house is where the sun comes in, and that's where my kitchen is. So actually, like, I don't have a lot of issues because my house heats up a lot on that side and in the kitchen. I also keep mine like right by the stove or the oven. So anytime I bake, you know, this is like a warmth. If you have a crock pot going and you want to, you know, give it a little extra love, just put it next to the crock pot. Not touching it, but, you know, a little heat radiates off that. There is a cheater trick, too, if you're in a pinch where you're like, oh, I got this 2 hours later than I wanted to, but I want to start something tonight. If you wrap it in a heating pad, that will work, too. I've done that in a pinch or to give it some extra love. And it won't... You know, you just want to make sure you keep it on like low. It can handle a little warmth, but you don't want to like bake it out or dehydrate it or something. I mean, you can still save it. Let me see, make sure I'm talking about everything. Does anybody have any questions up to here?
I have lots of questions, but I feel like you're gonna.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep going.
What about if your house is like 74?
It's gonna be really happy. Yeah.
I want to live with you.
Yeah.
I'm lying, so it's sweet.
If
you want to swear, come to my house.
Yeah.
If you don't,
like,
go.
stack 10.
Yeah.
I know. Our house is like 68, 70. My kids are still running around with tank tops on. I'm like, okay. So yeah, it will be really happy at your house. And they can't, I mean, unless it's like 90 degrees and you sit outside, it's, you know, otherwise it's going to be just fine. So we kind of talked about the 2 types of recipes. Does anybody have any more questions about starters? I was kind of going to go into bread making.
Will there be somewhere where we know kind of an idea of what to feed it?
Oh, thank you. Yes, ratios. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
I was like, that
So,
really, I don't know what to
This
do.
might sound really dumb, but what are you feeding it? Like,
Okay, so you're feeding it flour. Yes, thank you for these. You're feeding it flour and water. So it's made of flour and water. It gets fed flour and water. Almost all recipes are a 1-to-1 ratio of flour to water. If you're doing the precise method, example would be 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water.
Okay.
If you're doing the grandma style, which one of the bloggers in their farmhouse on Boone, she's more grandma style. She does like 1/4 of a cup of water, 1/4 of a cup of flour. That still works. It's not my favorite because I like to make a lot of bread, so I like more precise. Because sometimes they don't weigh the same even if they're same volume. So I hope I used that right. I mean,
makes
I'm
sense.
supposed to hope
Yeah.
so wrong, but I hope
Yeah.
I used that term right. But yeah, so sometimes people have an issue with her recipes not always like turning out as like professional, like as nicely. I mean, they're still good, but they might not be the same texture every time, or sometimes you might make English muffins that are like this and sometimes they're like that. And it's because of that lack of precision. So that's why I usually cook grandma style, but when it comes to this, I'm like, nope, I just need this. And it's nice because I have a 7-year-old, so I can say, can you feed it 50-50? And she knows what to do. So that's
To
also
measure
nice.
it.
Yeah, or my husband. Who's
So like an example of the starter we'll get, what's like a number that we should do the first time?
So what
Good question.
what we're probably gonna do today is either 25 or 50. Usually if it's like 50 is usually a good standard if you have kind of a little bit. And if you have more, I typically do 100. I usually do between 50 and 100. What do you have?
I just kind of, it depends on if I'm about to bake or if I'm going
Yes.
to just put it into the fridge, because I'll feed it a little bit right before I put it in the fridge. And if I do that, like if I had a jar like that and I was going to put it in the fridge, I'd put 20 grams of water, 20 grams of flour, and just a little something, like a little snack for it to put in the fridge.
Yeah.
But then when I bring it out, I dump it out, and I kind of eyeball it. So like I try to do the same amount of like starter to water to flour. So if I had it about here, then I'd probably do about 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, and that would get it up to probably about here to bake with and
When you
stuff.
say
So
dump it out, what do you mean by that?
that's the discard. So like that's where the discard comes in. So like this, she's fed it a lot to like to be able to share today. But like if I pulled this out and I want to bake with it, like she said, if you're trying to keep it even, like this is probably about 300 grams of starter. So I would need to feed it like 300 grams of water and 300 grams of flour, which it's kind of like, okay, but when you start like looking, that's like probably 2-3 cups of flour just to feed it.
Yeah.
And you use probably about 500 grams in a loaf. So you would just be going through a ton of flour.
So example, I fed this in the morning because I'm gonna make bagels tonight. Well, it's now 9 o'clock and I forgot to make bagels because life happens. Then I'm left with all this starter. That's a time when I would probably discard some. So that would mean, because I don't want to have to keep feeding it for how hungry it's going to be because I have so much. So I would discard, either save it in here, and then you could make, there's a million discard recipes, or if you're in a pinch or leaving and you don't want to save it, you throw it in the trash. But otherwise, you would save it. You can make crackers, pancakes, all of that stuff. But you will want to discard some if you have, for example, like this much, because you're not going to want to, again, feed it. Because it's you feel like you're wasting flour, because then now you're going to have double this, because it always doubles. So I'm going to have 2 of these, and then I'm like, what am I going to make now? And, examples.
Could you show with your fingers, like, about how much, like, all the recipes take, or is it totally
typically, most recipes I found are like between 50 and 100, especially if they're fermenting. So
Just the starter.
Just the starter.
And it's that whole thing? Oh,
no. So this
Okay.
would probably be, like she said, 200 to 300.
got it.
Sorry,
Okay.
is this your scale?
This is my scale, yes. This is what I use.
Okay.
And I linked it up in my resource guide. But I got it at Target. You can find them on Amazon.
Got mine at Whole Foods.
Yeah, like it's
So
just
it would
a food
normally be
scale.
just like that much for
Right.
like a recipe.
Oh, okay.
So, yes, I could probably make 2, like for those muffins, they needed 100 grams of starter, and so I could probably do that twice and still have starter left over. It really takes a small, if you're like trying to make a recipe happen, you kind of have to scrape the sides and you don't have a lot of starter left, it's still okay. It literally takes a teaspoon of starter to keep this alive.
Yes.
You do not need that much to keep it going. So if you're trying to scrape it, like, you'll be fine. It will still, I promise you, it'll grow the next day.
So for the discard, can you just like, we'll just pretend like cut half and like throw the half away? Is that what you mean by discard?
Yep, you literally I literally take it and pour it over the trash until I'm like, oh, that's a little bit left. Or in a jar, until I'm at that point.
Okay.
And you have a just discard jar as well in your fridge? Okay.
Yeah. I typically bake a lot with mine, or I'll just whip up a batch of crackers or biscuits or something. And so I don't usually keep a ton on hand, or sometimes if we're really busy, I will just dump it, which is wasteful, but also sometimes it's just life. So
I have a question.
yes.
How quickly does that grow? Like, let's say.
So I fed this last night at 8 p.m.
And what did it start at?
Yeah, what did it start?
It was probably there.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah, so
Oh,
it
wow.
typically doubles. So if I was to, that's the other thing, is to have a container where it can double. So say it's this much. If I was to try to feed this right now and leave it on the counter, it
Yeah.
would bubble over.
Right.
So knowing your container,
And would there
I'm gonna
ever
send you guys
be-
home in small jars, which this will not last more than one feeding, because we'll probably feed it to here and it will double.
Okay. Is
So-
a Tupperware glass Tupperware storage okay until I get a glass jar? I don't have
Yes.
a glass jar.
Mhm.
Okay.
I would definitely store it in a glass container.
Yeah.
And it needs to have a lid, but not airtight. Air still kind of has to flow. I like just setting the lid on top because it can bubble over. I saw hers had this. I will admit I don't love this method because it does dry out the top. And so then you kind of have to scrape that dried part off the top, which is fine. But I have like 4,000 of these in my house, so I just set them on top. So it's kind of your style, how you want to do it. My daughter would probably take the rubber band and make something out of it. That made me think. So when you have a starter, a lot of different things might happen. You're gonna forget to feed it for a couple days because it's okay. It's just gonna get really hungry. When a starter gets really hungry, a couple things happen. One, it starts to develop a different kind of scent. It will smell like nail polish remover, which is kind of funny. It will kind of get like a pinky looking, peach colored vibe on top. Like, it will kind of get a little bit dried out. And then if it gets really hungry, it's gonna start developing kind of like a liquid on top. That turns from pink to black, especially if you leave it in the fridge for, like I said, those 3 weeks or 4 weeks, it'll develop. That's called a hooch. All you do in any of those circumstances is pour it out or scrape the top off. As long as you have a teaspoon left in there, you're fine. It may take a couple feeding sessions to get it back to happy. Actually, at the beginning of the week, I was starting to panic because I did forget it for a couple days. And so then I was feeding it and it wasn't growing, and I was like, what? Like, I have a class this weekend. Like, I can't like it out of me. But I just gave it a little TLC. I just fed it morning and night instead of just once a day like I normally do, and it popped. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it just needs a little love.
So you throw all the pink and the black stuff away.
Now there are some like rogue sourdoughers out there that will mix it in and it will make for a pretty tangy flavor. But I'm not those people. I'm like, yeah,
Is it at what point does it become like
bad.
botulism or like
One, if it molds. If you ever have mold on your starter, throw it away. And sometimes,
And the mold is fuzzy mold.
yes.
So like because I know sometimes people like the pink and the black, they think it's mold,
Right.
but it's not. The mold is fuzzy mold.
Yeah, like
Okay.
your stereotypical, you leave this,
Green, white.
like you ever leave the spaghetti sauce in
Yeah.
the fridge and it kind of has that
White
fuzzy,
and then the- yep.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
we've all been there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gosh, I'm glad I'm not the only one.
That's the only time I throw my food away.
Yeah,
Right.
like, so if it's moldy, it cannot be saved. That's literally,
Yeah.
some
Death row.
sourdoughs say the only time. But if you're not comfortable with it, you know,
And if you're not making an item for a while, like it's fine to leave it in the fridge
Right.
for weeks and weeks and weeks.
yeah, so if you leave it in for a week, I would get it
But
out.
keep
feed
feeding
in
it
a week,
once a week.
but put it back in there. I mean, as long as you're feeding it every
And
week
feed
to a week and a half,
and then immediately put it back in the fridge.
I'd give it a couple hours on the counter if you
Okay.
can. But if you forget it, for
Like she
a
said,
day-
a snack.
yeah, give it a snack.
I usually
Let it
pull
have-
mine out for like if I know I'm not gonna be baking or something, I'll pull it out in the morning, let it sit, feed it that night, and then put it back in the fridge the next morning.
Okay.
Or, feed it that night before dinner and put it back in the fridge after dinner.
Okay.
So I give it a little time during the day to kind of like wake
Yeah.
up, warm up and everything, give it a little snack, and then let it digest a little bit, and then
I've kind of designated.
it's literally it's like a pet.
Yeah, I think there's a quote on the front of the thing. Will you read that, Kate? The
Sourdough is basically an edible
Tamagotchi.
tamagotchi.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, that's kind of true. You just kind of like, I know. It's like, I feel like we're all from the 90s. So the other thing is I've kind of designated like, because like everything needs a habit attached to it. So like you need to tag it to something. So morning and night is like when I tackle this, like not in the middle of the day or whatever. So you kind of got to find your times, your rhythms that work for you.
But you don't feed it usually twice a day.
No.
Okay.
I don't. And that's the other thing is like she said, you kind of attach everything to like 12-hour stints. So like feed it in the morning, put it in the fridge at night, or, take it out in the morning, feed it at night, put it in the fridge in the morning. Like just kind of use those little,
A lot of this stuff too, like once you start doing it, it'll make more sense. So you guys all got invited here by one of us probably. So if you get into this and have questions, like I would just message one of us, because that's probably going to be the best way to really like comprehend this, is just kind of like doing it. Like when I first started doing this, I was like Marco Poloing my friend who told me about it. I've got flour all over my hands. I'm like, what did I do wrong? Like, this is like,
Right.
it's a mess. Like, and so she, walked me through it and stuff like that. So I don't get too overwhelmed by it right now. Like, and I think Jess, were you gonna feed some or were you gonna, okay.
Yeah,
So you can watch, you'll see her feed it here and then we're gonna actually like do some of these steps so you'll see it in action and I think it'll make a little bit more sense.
Yes.
One more question about the lid. Do you put the screw top on too?
I don't.
Or
I
for
just
you
leave
just
it like
okay.
this. Also, another fun fact, especially if you just have a light lid like this, I've looked in and found a fruit fly in there.
Oh.
And at first I was like, no! When in doubt, just scoop it out.
Yep.
So just scoop it out. Apparently it's a very normal thing. And when that's one of those things, like I kind of had to go back to my grandma, my inner, like, they would have just thrown this out 50, even 50 years ago. Like that we've kind of, like you kind of have to really get into a very intuitive place to like say like, just scoop it out. Like it's just a little fruit fly. Like,
Right.
so, kind of, and you don't feel like you have to be super like, this is bacteria, this is what's, this is good. So like, yes, if you have dirty hands, but if you're just like whatever and you like have some on the spoon, it's okay to just scoop it out with your finger. Like I've had friends like, like, what do I do with that stuff on the spoon? Just push it out with your finger. Wash your hands. The other thing about sourdough is it is very sticky. And so any spoon or item or anything that this touches will become a clay. And so you're gonna wanna either soak it or rinse it right away. Any sourdough husband will tell you it is not fun to get those dishes.
Can you just rinse this off when you're done?
Yeah.
Well,
It's like, so I always try to either rinse it right away or just stick it in a cup with water. And so
Good tip.
Okay, so I'm gonna feed this and show you guys an example. I have plenty, so when we're all done kind of chatting, if you want to bring some home, you can feed it and we'll do that all here and you can take it home fed. And you can stick it right in the fridge if you want to, if you're nervous about it, and you can just keep it there until you're ready. Like, and if you kill it or throw it away, I don't want you to take any guilt. I know this is like, it's okay. Like, there's no guilt if you kill it or don't want to do it anymore. Yeah, like, if you're worried about it, just do something nice for somebody else. I don't know. It's gonna be fine.
I have one more question
Yeah,
for you.
all the questions.
So how do you start your starter if you don't have someone to get it from?
So that's a little more of an intensive process. It takes about 10 days to really establish a good starter. But again, it's just a ratio of, and there's a lot of tutorials out there, but it's just literally flour and water and you just start feeding it. You're just really fermenting it with its own self with the...
And I don't know if this is approved or not, but somebody was telling me Hy-Vee and Le Cordier sell a starter.
Yep.
And Le Cordier, there's one in Omaha too.
Some places like that will either sell you their starter or give you some. And now there's a ton of places where you can buy dehydrated starters online, like Ballerina Farms, who I love.
Oh,
she
yeah.
sells her starter. But like I've watched her process of like...
it's different.
Well, and I watched her process of rehydrating the starter. And it's like multiple days process, which is what it took me to start this one. So I was a little like,
Yeah.
Might as well just
But
start your
also,
own.
Well, nowadays,
just call a friend and get some. Like,
Yeah.
I will literally, because like you hear how much we talk about discard.
That's true.
People are like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, literally, I was going to throw this in the trash or put it in my fridge for who knows how long. Like, it's okay to get starter. Like, it takes just a little bit. Like, I will give starter to anybody. But I love to feed all the people. So, but again, don't be afraid to reach out to people that you know. Like every sourdough person will be like, yeah, just bring a jar over, I'll scoop some in, So it's very much that. Do you have a spoon?
Yep.
Can I ask you a quick